Welcome to part 2 of the prison epistles. We're going to be dealing with the letters to Colossians and Philemon. So we'll look at Colossians first. The characteristics, the reason scholars get hung up again is because of the language and style. There's a large number of hypoxygomena used only once in the New Testament, maybe the result of several possible reasons. First, Paul had his own fertile mind and imagination. He certainly had a vocabulary bigger than the words we're exposed to in his letters. Then second, he may have used the same amanuensis for writing this letter and Ephesians and Philemon, perhaps. Allowing him the liberty to use his own words and style would account for this difference. We also see a number of terms that are found in Gnostic literature. So some scholars have posited that the provenience is Gnosticism, but that's somewhat anachronistic. We don't have any compelling evidence to believe that a pseudo-Christian Gnosticism existed in the first century when these prison letters were being written. We know from internal evidence that there's a high Christology. In other words, we see references to the deity of Christ in several ways. And in particular, the terms that are used, and we're going to address those terms later, but just that observation leads some scholars to posit a second century composition because they believe in an evolutionary view and developing view of seeing Christ as divine. Well, that's a presupposition that has no basis. We see very early in the church a high view of the divinity of Christ. The theme of Colossians is, here it is, Christ the universal and supreme Lord of all creation. So there's somewhat a cosmic perspective to this epistle, looking at the cosmos, looking at the universe. So Paul's mysticism, we saw that in Ephesians. We see it again in Colossians. Being in Christ is a way of referring to the believer's union with Christ. Somehow, by regeneration, we are incorporated spiritually into Christ. So what is said of Christ is said of us. We're seated in the heavenly places with Christ. Spiritually, this union and identification with Christ is something that Paul is exploring in Colossians. Believers are to have the mind that is otherworldly because our real existence is in Christ. Therefore, set your minds on the things above, not on things on the earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When? When you died and go to heaven? No. Now you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, you also will be revealed with him in glory. So we have both a present and a future sense of our real identity in Christ in this book. A believer's life hidden in Christ, our real identity will be revealed at the revelation of Christ, the second coming. But now it's hidden in Christ. Believers are to put on the new man with a qualitatively different lifestyle. The phrase the new man or the new self, as some translations have it, is referring to what 1 Corinthians says about being incorporated into the second Adam. Adam was the first man. Now we are the new man because we are in Christ. And that requires us, if we're going to put on that new man, to put on Christ and adopt a qualitatively different lifestyle. Occasion, Colossians is not founded by Paul. Chapter 2, verse 1 makes that clear. They have not seen me in the flesh, he says. Established by Epaphras during his third missionary journey. Remember, Paul was in Asia Minor for quite some time. In fact, he spent almost 3 years in Ephesus. And he had apostolic associates during that time that were going out, preaching the gospel, planting churches. And we can read about this in Acts 19, verse 8 through 10. And Paul is visited by Epaphras while in prison in Rome, according to Colossians 4, 12 and 13. He learns from him of heretical teachings that are being disseminated up and down the Lacus Valley from Ephesus to Colossae. So Paul writes to correct those teachings and to give some doctrinal instruction. So at the end of Colossians, there's all these names, and as you look at them closely, they're all interconnected with the books of Philemon, Colossians, and we see a few of them in the prison epistles. Colossian heresy. There's some false teaching spread, and Paul attempts to correct that. What was the heresy? Well, it really depends on who you think the opponents of Paul are, whether they're Jewish or Gentile or a mixture of both. But my gut feeling is that, based on kind of years of reading all this literature, is that it's almost impossible to separate any of Paul's audiences as one or the other exclusively. I think there are both Jews and Gentiles in the churches in the diaspora, in the churches outside of Palestine. I think that you have to see this as a mixture. What's the precise nature? We don't know, but it has these elements. It's rooted in speculative philosophy and man-made traditions. Now, really that goes both ways. It's not just a Greek influence here. I think of Philo, the Alexandrian philosopher, who was alive during this time. He was an old man during the 50s, but he was still alive. So the philosophy, speculative philosophy, went both ways, and man-made traditions, certainly. Jewish, we think of Jews having man-made traditions, but so did the Greek. So this heresy included a form of legalism, which we read about in chapter 2. If you have died with Christ, why, as if you were living in the world, do you submit yourself to decrees such as do not handle, do not taste, do not touch, in accordance with the commandments and teachings of men? These are, of course, characteristics of some forms of Judaism, but believe me, as you've read in Ferguson, there's plenty of traditions in the Greco-Roman religious traditions. It included a form of false mysticism, spiritual elevation through visions or worship or veneration of angels. 2:18 says, let no one keep defrauding you of your prize by delighting in self-abasement, that's asceticism, and the worship of angels, taking his stand on visions he has seen. Included a demotion of Christ to creaturely status. We read about that in 1:17-19. So what does he do to refute this? Is to teach the supremacy of Christ over all creation. He is before all things, Paul says, and in him all things hold together. And he's the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that he might have the supremacy over everything. And if they miss that point, he goes on to say, for God was pleased to have all the fullness. Fullness of what? Fullness of deity, to dwell in him. The same point is in chapter 2, verse 9. For in Christ all the fullness of the deity lives in bodily form. So included this is asceticism, a way of spiritual maturity through rules and practices and denying of self. That could apply to either Greeks or Jews as well. We tend to think of Jews as being ascetic in their restrictive ways, like kosher laws and so forth, but the type of asceticism depicted in Colossians appears to be a means of spiritual elevation and maturity through certain rules and practices. So when asceticism gets tied to the prospect of sanctification as a means of elevating oneself or promoting oneself spiritually, it becomes an error and can lead to a larger heresy. Well, it also included a false reconciliation between the believer and the cosmos. Now, there is a reconciliation between God and man through the cross, and even God and creation. Man, of course, through his sin was alienated from God, hostile with God, rebelling through evil works. And what has God done? Well, through the cross, he reconciled man to God. And now there's peace. Man can approach God in the righteousness of Christ, and because his sins have been forgiven, we have peace with God. So there's a kind of a summary here, is that the teachings are not according to Christ, whatever this Colossian heresy is. It's not from the apostles, expounded the teachings of Christ in the gospel, but are from the traditions of men. Some critical issues related to this book, of course, is Pauline authorship. The first two, we've talked about those. But how about this one? Too much similarity with Ephesians. The same author, they say, could not have written both. And you ask yourself, why not? Well, especially if they were written close together to people in the same area, similar circumstances and issues, especially if they were both written by the same amanuensis. Then why could they not be very similar in concept and in vocabulary that's present? Well, the theology, some claim, is non-Pauline, a high Christology. It presents a cosmic Christ, And this is somewhat different than what we find in other Pauline epistles. But that only says that the Colossian church, being informed by Epaphras, had this as an issue in their heresy, and it required Paul to address salvation on those terms. So a different occasion requires different concepts and content. And I might just note this, that there's nothing in Colossians about Christology that contradicts what Paul says elsewhere. Difference doesn't necessarily mean contradiction. Okay, so the identification of the Colossian heresy, whether it was Jewish or Gentile, I think really most scholars are comfortable saying it was a mixture of both. The key theme, the supremacy of Christ, the universal Lord of creation, the head of the church. Universal cosmic reconciliation through Christ's death on the cross. This is a wonderful passage. All things were reconciled to God, things seen and unseen, believers and creation. Now, I don't know actually how that works, but we have a prophetic picture in the Old Testament of the day of the Lord and the kinds of transformations that's going to happen in creation. All kinds of metaphorical pictures, like the hills will skip like lambs, the heavens will sing, the lion and the lamb will lie down together. In other words, when God wraps up his plan of redemption, completely renewing everything, as 2 Peter 3 even says, that in keeping with his promise, we're looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth where righteousness dwells. And the new earth is pictured for us also in the book of Revelation. So just in brief, Colossians mentions a universal reconciliation that embraces the cosmos, the physical world. The supremacy of Christ over all creation includes all supernatural forces or beings connected with Satan's domain. For he has rescued us, he says in 1:13, from the dominion, the exousia, the authority of darkness, and transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son. So the supremacy of Christ over creation includes all supernatural beings connected with Satan's domain. The unity of all mankind in the one new man, the new self. Very similar to Ephesians. All believers form one church. Through incorporation into Christ, we are put in union with Christ. That union with Christ is our righteousness. In fact, that's how many scholars define righteousness, as union with Christ. The adequacy of Christ's redemption, the completeness of salvation. He is in us, the hope of glory. Glory of what? Glory is what God is. We all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And we are going to share in that glory in the resurrection. We're going to be conformed to that glory. 2 Corinthians 3:18, we are being right now transformed from glory to glory because of the supremacy of his revelation, because of the adequacy of his atonement, his dying on the cross as an offering for sin, the completeness of salvation. And then there's the attendant lifestyle that distinguishes the new man, the new self in Christ. How important was it for Paul to exhort believers to live a life that demonstrates the redemption they've experienced? Well, it's very important to live out the new man we are in Christ. Okay, the last letter in the Epistles is Philemon. Keeping in mind here that this is written to an individual, to Philemon, and not to a church. So it is intensely personal. Only one of all four Pauline letters addressed to individuals, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus and Philemon. It has a limited focus then. It's written for a very personal and specific purpose. You might say that it's the principles of redemption in Christ applied to a typical first century household that included not only the parents and the children, but also servants or slaves. So the key theme is an appeal to forgive based on love for God's family, a love for the household of God, forgiveness, the ethos of love. So Paul sets the tone in verses 5 through 7. I hear about your love for all his holy people. Your love has given me great joy. And in verse 9, yet I prefer to appeal to you on the basis of love. So he could use his authority and tell Philemon, you accept Onesimus and don't punish him. He's a brother in Christ now. But instead, He appeals to him on the basis of love. But it's forgiveness for what? Well, we'll see that in the next slide on the occasion. But while dealing with the issue of slavery tendentially, the New Testament nowhere condemns it. But of course, Paul does set forth principles relating to it. Corinthians 7. Were you a slave when you were called? That is, when you became a Christian? Don't let it trouble you. Although, if you can gain your freedom, do so. How? By running away? No, he's talking about their manumission, or buying back your freedom by paying off your debt. Or most often what they would do is do a sacral manumission, that is, they would go to a temple, pay for his manumission. And so this is a common practice. For he goes on to say in 1 Corinthians verse 22, 7:22, for the one who was a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's free person. Similarly, the one who was free when called is Christ's slave. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. Now notice that, a straightforward command. Do not become slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, he says, each person, as responsible to God, should remain in the situation that you were in when God called them. In other words, social status, social position is not your identity. Your position in Christ is your identity. But notice Paul recognizes freedom is better. Why? In order to be free to serve Christ, who purchased us with his blood. We really belong to him. So Paul says, do not become slaves to human beings. Also, Paul says in Colossians 3, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. Here, there is no Gentile or Jew. So in the new self, there's no Gentile or Jew, no circumcised or uncircumcised, no barbarian or Scythian, or slave or free. But Christ is all and is in all. So for the new man, Paul says, there is no slave or free, because Christ is all and in all. Instead, Paul calls himself the slave of Christ. But on the surface, there is no outright condemnation of the social institution of slavery. Why? Why doesn't he just come out and say, look, Philemon, slavery is an abomination in the eyes of God. Set Onesimus free, set all your slaves free, because this is clearly a sin. Well, he doesn't do that. And that gets us into the occasion. Onesimus ran away to Rome, was converted by Paul, and now is returning to Philemon. Who is Philemon? Paul's convert during his extended stay in Ephesus in Acts 19:10. So Philemon's slave Onesimus runs away to Rome, perhaps after stealing some goods. Paul says, if he's done any wrong to you or owes you anything, charge it to me. I, Paul, writing this with my own hand, I will pay it back. Put it on my account. So while Onesimus was in Rome, he crossed paths with Paul, who converted him, and Onesimus then willingly stayed with Paul and served him. Paul, when he discovered that he was a runaway slave, he realized the only proper move was to send Onesimus back to reconcile to Philemon and to make things right. Otherwise, he would be violating Christian principles to submit yourself to the authority that you're under. So you might say Paul is mediating for Onesimus by asking Philemon to forgive him and to restore him back to faithful service, to receive his slave, not with legal action, but as a brother. Now, we have to keep in mind that in the Greco-Roman world, slaves were property. They were sometimes called animate tools. They had no legal rights of their own, and the penalty for runaway slaves could be death. There was nothing stopping Philemon disciplining Onesimus to whatever level he deemed appropriate. So Paul is intervening on his behalf. The letter then becomes an opportunity to instruct the church on divine forgiveness within the household of faith. Well, why was this letter accepted and used in the church? It's so short, narrowly focused on a particular issue. Why was it adopted into the New Testament canon? Another question is this the letter from Laodicea that's mentioned in Colossians 4:16? Well, we don't know. We'll never know. But its relation to the Colossian epistle is certainly close. Some of the same names appear in both epistles, verses 23 and 24 in Philemon and Colossians 4. Philemon may be from Colossae. And we see Tacticus, he's one of you. And he's coming with Onesimus, our faithful brother, who is one of you. Questions of whether Paul or Christianity endorsed slavery as a social institution has been raised. And I would be very surprised if you didn't find in the 19th century slave owners arguing for the legitimate use of slaves based on the fact that Paul did not condemn slavery in this little epistle. But certainly, the theme of forgiveness based on love for God's people is paramount in this epistle, which creates a parallel with the forgiving and redeeming work of Christ. First of all, we see an offense. Then there's an appeal for compassion. Then there's an intercession in 3 verses. Then there's a substitution, a willingness to put it on his account, pay his debt. I will pay it. Sounds like the Good Samaritan, is needed, put it on my account. Then there's the restoration to favor and reconciliation, and then an elevation of a new relationship. When you look at all of this in this order that is presented in this book, you realize it's a paradigm of the gospel message of what God has done for us in Christ. That's got to be on purpose. Paul did that on purpose. So the question is, how to live as a Christian in a particular social context. I think that's explored here in this book. Christianity came to those already enmeshed in a social historical context. Thousands of years of slavery existed before the Roman Empire ever even existed. So slavery was ensconced all through every culture of the world at that time. So he confronts it using biblical principles. It raises the possibility of transformation, social transformation of the gospel that's in the gospel. Paul did not attack, advocate rebellion against the institution of slavery. Why? Well, Ferguson reminds us on page 59 in Backgrounds to Early Christianity that 1 in 5 residents in Rome were slaves. So for Paul to condemn it and come at it head on would have put his head on the chopping block, literally, and for all Christians in the empire. From that moment on, slaves would have tried to rebel. Well, all you have to do is read the history of slavery in the Greco-Roman world, and you know that slave revolts were not tolerated. Rome treated those kinds of revolts with severity and decisive action. Now, if Paul's letter had just condemned it outright in unequivocal terms, and Roman authorities found a copy of it, that would have been the end of Christianity, the end of Christians everywhere. So Paul's so-called silence may be providential, allowing the seed of truth to permeate the heart of Philemon and all those who would read this epistle. And I think that's why it's put in the canon. And we come to realize that to be a fully submissive Christian to the will of God and to live out the new self, the new man in every arena of your life, you cannot tolerate slavery.